Today, we honor the memory of Dr. King by sharing with you some of his earliest recorded speeches and allowing him to speak for himself. We begin this broadcast with the earliest surviving record of Dr. King recorded by Pacifica Radio. On June 24, 1957, almost 50 years ago, our station KPFA in Berkeley recorded Dr. King at the Wheeler Hall at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. King delivered a speech entitled "The Power of Peaceful Persuasion" to students and faculty of the university. When KPFA broadcast the speech on August 1st, 1957, thousands of our listeners were entranced by his oratory. We begin with an introduction by UC Berkeley's Dean Hart, courtesy of the Pacifica Radio Archives.
The Department of Sociology, the School of Social Welfare, the University YMCA, and the University YWCA, and the Campus Committee on Drama, Lectures, and Music are all privileged to present the Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. This is a resounding list of sponsors. It is by no means too imposing for the significance of the man welcomed to Berkeley. Out of Montgomery, Alabama, the first capital of the Confederacy, there has come to us and to the rest of the nation a man who strives not for division, but for unity among all men. Placing his faith in moral and spiritual power, this pastor has taught us, as well as his parishioners, the force that is in passive resistance as he follows the teachings of Jesus and the techniques of Gandhi. The Reverend King, now 28 and only 26 years of age when his great public career began, came to the pulpit in keeping with a family tradition, for both his father and his grandfather have been pastors. Born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1929, Martin Luther King, Jr. attended that city's Morehouse College that he could best serve humanity by entering the ministry. Therefore, he went next to the Crozier Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, where he was one of 6 Negroes among 100 students. He won the school's award as its outstanding student and was president of its senior class. After graduation, he enrolled at Boston University and then, at that time also, took courses at Harvard, which led to his PhD at Boston. Upon completion of his formal education, the Reverend King refused offers from several northern churches so as to work with his own people in his own part of the country. Since September 1954, he has been the pastor of Montgomery's Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Only a little more than a year after his assumption of this pastorate, Dr. King was elected president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, the organization that was called into being to conduct the famous boycott of buses, an organization which he led with great but peaceful power. Aided by the Reverend Ralph Abernathy and the Reverend Robert Gretz and others, he conducted his campaign of boycott successfully for 381 days. Although harried by terrorism and by malevolent suit, by bigotry and by bombs, by writ and by threat, the Reverend King unflinchingly continued his policy of peaceful persuasion. It is of this that he will speak today. Martin Luther once said, "A man may do good works, but good works do not make a good man." Today we have with us the great Luther's namesake, and here is a good man who has done good works. On behalf of the University of California, I am pleased and privileged to present this man, the Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr.
Mr. Vice Chancellor, members of the faculty, and members of the student body of this great institution. I need not pause to say how delighted I am to be here this afternoon and to be a part of this very rich experience. I'm certainly indebted to the Vice Chancellor for this gracious introduction, and I can hardly speak to any audience in America without pausing for a moment to say thank you. And I want to express my personal appreciation to you for the moral support and even financial support that you have given us in the struggle for freedom and justice in Montgomery, Alabama. This afternoon I come to tell the dramatic story of a handsome little city which has been known over the years as the cradle of the Confederacy. It is a story of a Negro community grappling with a new and creative approach to the crisis in race relations. It is impossible, however, to understand the Montgomery story and the techniques of persuasion involved without understanding the larger story of the radical change in the Negro's evaluation of himself. The brief survey of the history of the Negro in America reveals this change in terms that are crystal clear. You will well remember that it was in the year of 1619 that the first slaves landed on the shores of this nation. They were brought here from the soils of Africa. Unlike the Pilgrim Fathers who landed at Plymouth a year later, they were brought here against their wills. And throughout slavery, the Negro was treated in a very inhuman fashion. He was a thing to be used, not a person to be respected. He was merely a depersonalized cog in the vast plantation machine. The famous Dred Scott decision of 1857 well illustrates the status of the Negro during slavery. For in this decision, the United States Supreme Court said in substance that the Negro is not a citizen of this nation. He is merely property subject to the dictates of his owner. And with the growth of slavery, it became necessary to give some justification for it. It seems to be a fact of life that human beings cannot continue to do wrong without eventually reaching out for some rationalization which ends up clothing an obvious wrong in the beautiful garments of righteousness. And this is exactly what happened. And the men of the slave owners faced the danger that forever confronts religion and a too literalistic interpretation of the Bible. That is the danger that religion and the Bible, not properly interpreted, will be used as instruments to crystallize the status quo. And this is exactly what happened. And so it was argued from pulpits across the nation that the Negro was inferior by nature because of Noah's curse upon the children of Ham. Paul's dictum became a watchword: servants, be obedient to your master. And one of the ministers had probably read something of the logic of Aristotle, and so he could put his argument in a form comparable to an Aristotelian syllogism. He could say all men are made in the image of God. That's a major premise. Then comes a minor premise. God, as everybody knows, is not a Negro. Then comes a conclusion. Therefore, the Negro is not a man. This was the type of reasoning. This was the type of reasoning that prevailed. Living under these conditions, many Negroes lost faith in themselves. Many came to feel that perhaps they were less than human. The tragedy of physical slavery is that it always leads to the paralysis of mental slavery. So long as the Negro accepted this place assigned to him, this subservient attitude, a sort of racial peace was maintained. But it was an uneasy peace in which the Negro was forced patiently to accept injustice and exploitation. It was a negative peace. It was not positive peace, because true peace is not merely the absence of some negative force, but the presence of some positive force. True peace is not merely the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. And the peace which existed at this time was a negative peace, devoid of any positive meaning. But then something happened to the Negro. Circumstances made it necessary for him to travel more. His rural plantation background gradually gave way to an urban industrial life. His cultural life was gradually rising through the steady decline of crippling illiteracy. And even his economic life was developing through the influence of organized labor and the growth of industry. And all of these forces conjoined to cause the Negro to take a new look at himself. Negro masses all over began to reevaluate themselves, and the Negro came to feel that he was somebody. He came to see that the important thing about a man is not his specificity, but his fundamentum. Not the color of his skin or the texture of his hair, but the quality of his soul. And with this new sense of dignity and this new self-respect, a new Negro emerged. And with the emergence of this new Negro, the negative peace was gradually undermined. And the tension which we witness in the Southland today can be explained in part by the revolutionary change in the Negro's evaluation of his nature and destiny, and his determination to struggle and sacrifice until justice is a reality. This is at bottom the meaning of the Montgomery story. For it is impossible to understand what happened and what is happening in Montgomery without understanding that there is a new Negro in America with a new sense of dignity and destiny. If a visitor had come to Montgomery prior to December the 5th, 1955, he would have noticed bus operators calling Negro passengers names that one is almost ashamed to mention. He would have noticed at times Negro passengers getting on the front door of the bus and paying the fare, and then being forced to get off and go to the back in order to board the bus. And often he would have noticed the bus pulling off before the Negro passenger could get to the back. But even more, he would occasionally notice Negro passengers standing over empty seats. And pretty soon it would have been revealed to him that these empty seats were reserved for whites only. This custom went even beyond that. If white passengers filled the reserved section, which had about 10 seats for whites, if they filled all of these seats, and it became necessary or other white passengers boarded the bus, the Negro passengers seated immediately behind the reserved section were asked to stand and move to the back in order that the white passengers could be seated. And if the Negro passengers refused to move, to stand up, they were arrested. On the 1st of December, Mrs. Rosa Parks was asked to give up her seat, to move back in order that a white passenger could be seated. And it is interesting to note that Mrs. Parks was not seated in one of the 10 reserved seats. She was seated in the first seat of the unreserved section. And if she had given up her seat, she would have had to stand while a male white passenger would have been seated. But in a quiet, calm, and dignified manner so characteristic of the radiant personality of Mrs. Parks, she refused to move back. And the result was her arrest. Her trial was set up for Monday, December the 5th. And almost out of nowhere, leaflets were circulated around the Negro community saying this must be stopped. Another Negro woman has been humiliated and arrested because she refused to give up her seat for a white passenger. And then it suggested that the Negro citizens should protest by refusing to ride the buses on Monday, the day that the trial was set. The word got around amazingly well. All of the Negro ministers came together and endorsed the plan with hearty enthusiasm. By Monday, the word was around the city. Then came Monday morning, December the 5th, and the buses were empty. All day long, Negro passengers, which constituted 75% of the bus riders, refused to ride. The Negro community was now united in a way that it had never been united before. And from that day to the end of the protest, which was 381 days, Negro passengers cooperated with this endeavor. More than 99% cooperated. It was more than 99% successful from the very beginning. Realizing at the very beginning the need for some guiding organization to give direction to the protest, the ministers and civic leaders came together on the afternoon of December the 5th and organized the Montgomery Improvement Association. And it is this association that has guided and directed the protest, or rather that guided and directed the protest for all of the 381 days. This organization is led on by some of the most outstanding ministers and civic leaders of the Montgomery community. And through this organization, it was always necessary to stress unity and the need for sticking together for a great cause. And certainly this was one of the techniques to bring people together across denominational lines and somehow urge them to subject their particular egos to the greatness of the cause. And for more than a year, the members of this organization worked together amazingly well. The ministers of the city called a mass meeting for Monday night, December the 5th, urging the Negro citizens of the community to come out and discuss the problem together. And by 3 o'clock that afternoon, people started assembling in the church, and by 7 o'clock, the church was overflowing with more than 5,000 persons, more than 3,000 or 4,000 standing on the outside. It was in this meeting that these persons unanimously voted to adopt the following resolution: that Negro passengers would not resume riding the buses until more courtesy was extended from the bus drivers, until the seating arrangement had been changed to a first-come, first-served basis, and until Negro bus drivers had been hired. And so the one-day protest from that day became an indefinite protest, which lasted 381 days. The picture is becoming clear now. Almost every Negro citizen of Montgomery had had some humiliating experience on the buses. If he had not had an experience himself, he had witnessed a humiliating experience that someone else had suffered. But there comes a time when people get tired. There comes a time when people get tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression. There comes a time when people get tired of being plunged across the abyss of exploitation, where they experience the bleakness of nagging injustice. And so the story of Montgomery is the story of 50,000 Negroes who became tired of injustice and who came to see that it is ultimately more honorable to walk in dignity than ride in humiliation. A group of people who were willing to substitute tired feet for tired souls and walk the streets of Montgomery until the sagging walls of segregation were finally crushed by the battering rams of historical necessity. This is at bottom the meaning of the Montgomery story. One of the first practical problems that the ex-bus riders confronted was that of working out some way to get around the city, to get to and from their jobs and to get to and from other places that they were interested in going. And this need was met first by having the taxis of the city to operate on a jitney rate, a cheap jitney rate, for 10 cents, the same as the buses charge. But this was immediately stopped by the police commissioner, who said to the taxis that you will be arrested if you do not stop this day. And he set up a minimum of 45 cents that every taxi had to comply with. And so it was necessary to move into another area. And almost overnight, we had worked together and brought more than 300 private cars to form a carpool. And even the police commissioner had to admit once in a White Citizens Council meeting that the transportation system operated with military precision. It worked amazingly well. And this was one of the ways that the people were able to get around. It did not meet the whole problem. People still had to walk and sacrifice, but it did help out. And with all of these automobiles being used and finally station wagons, we were able to organize a transportation system. From the very beginning, there was an attempt on the part of the opposition to block the protest. I should say that was an attempt on the part of the reactionary forces of the white community. For I would not like to leave the impression with any of you that all of the white persons in Alabama are unsympathetic with the cause of human dignity and justice. I have always felt, and I still feel, that there are more moderate persons in the white South than appears on the surface, persons of goodwill. And today they are in a state of fear, afraid to speak out, afraid to take a definite stand, feared of economic, political, and social reprisals. But they are there in larger numbers and sometimes appears on the surface. So I must stress the fact that the reactionary elements of the white community sought to block the protest. They used several methods. The first method was that of seeking to negotiate us into a compromise. And after that didn't work, a second method emerged, and that was a method that I like to call conquer by dividing, dividing in order to conquer. And that was an attempt to split up the unity of the leadership. Many persons of the opposition and of the reactionary white community went to some of the old ministers in the Negro community and said, now, if this thing has to exist and it has to take place, it seems that you should be in the leadership. You've been here all these years, and the people looked over you and called on these young men. It just looks bad that you aren't leading this thing. Now, that was an attempt to create jealousy among the leaders. And then there was the attempt to spread false rumors concerning the leaders of the protest, saying that the ministers were doing nothing but making a lot of money and buying Cadillac cars and using it to their personal ends. That didn't work. After this method didn't work, the method of which might be referred to as a get tough policy came into being. And this was really a method used, it boiled down in the final analysis that it was a series of arrests for minor and imaginary traffic violations. Hundreds of people were arrested just to be arrested in order to break the unity. But that didn't stop it. After the get tough policy didn't work, physical violence came into being. The homes of several persons were bombed, but that didn't stop it. After that didn't work, then came the mass arrests. More than 96 persons were indicted for leading an illegal boycott, as the law said. These persons were indicted on the basis of an old anti-labor law of doubtful constitutionality. And even that didn't stop it. And so the protest continued in the midst of all of this opposition for many, many months, 381 days.
I'm Ambrose Eileen Sr., and you are listening to the Pacifica Radio Archive's King Holiday Celebration. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered this speech, The Power of Peaceful Persuasion, on June 24th, 1957.
Now let me come to one of the basic points. From the very beginning, there was a philosophy undergirding the boycott. We often refer to it as the philosophy of nonviolent resistance or the philosophy of passive resistance. As you well know, this is a method made famous by Mahatma Gandhi of our generation, and he used it to free his people from the political domination, economic exploitation, and humiliation inflicted upon them by Britain. The method of passive resistance. Now, that was always the problem of getting this method over, because it didn't make sense to most of the people in the beginning. And so we had to use our mass meetings as a place to get the philosophy of nonviolence over to a community of people who had never heard of the philosophy and in many instances were not sympathetic with it. We had meetings twice per week on Mondays and Thursdays, and we used these meetings as an opportunity to teach and lecture on the philosophy of nonviolent resistance. And even in the midst of our struggle, we had institutes. We had an institute on nonviolence and social change, to study social change and to get over the philosophy of nonviolence. And there were certain basic things that we had to make clear in the beginning about this philosophy. We had to make it clear that this was not a method of cowardice. It does resist. It is not a method of stagnant passivity and deadening complacency. The nonviolent resistor is just as opposed to the evil that he is standing against as the violent resistor. But he resists without violence. This method is passive physically, but dynamically active spiritually. It is non-aggressive physically, but strongly aggressive spiritually. Another thing that we had to get over concerning this method was the fact that the nonviolent resistor does not seek to humiliate or defeat the opponent, but to win his friendship and understanding. This was always a cry that we had to set before the people, that our aim is not to defeat the white community, not to humiliate the white community, but to win the friendship of all of the persons who have perpetrated this system in the past. The end of violence or the aftermath of violence is bitterness. But the aftermath of nonviolence is reconciliation and the creation of the beloved community. And that is the type of thing that we are trying to get over. That a boycott is never an end within itself. It is merely a means to awaken a sense of shame within the oppressor, but the end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. And then we had to make it clear also that the nonviolent resistor seeks to attack the evil system rather than individuals who happen to be caught up in the system. And this is why I say from time to time that the struggle in Montgomery, the struggle in the South, is not so much a tension between white people and Negro people. The struggle is at bottom a tension between justice and injustice, between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. And if there is a victory, it will not be a victory merely for 50,000 Negroes, but it will be a victory for justice, a victory for goodwill, a victory for democracy. The method of nonviolent resistance seeks to attack evil systems rather than individuals who happen to be victimized with these evil systems. That is another basic thing that we had to get over. That is that nonviolent resistance is also an internal matter. It not only avoids external violence, external physical violence, but also internal violence of spirit. It not only refuses to shoot a man, but it refuses to hate him. And so at the center of our movement stood the philosophy of love, the attitude that the only way to ultimately change humanity and make for the society that we all long for is to keep love at the center of our lives. Now, people used to ask me from the beginning, what do you mean by love, and how is it that you can tell us to love those persons who seek to defeat us and those persons who stand against us? How can you love such persons? And I had to make it clear all along that love in its highest sense is not a sentimental sort of thing, not even an affectionate sort of thing. It's very interesting that the Greek language uses 3 words for love. It talks about eros. And eros is a sort of aesthetic love. Plato talks about it a great deal in his dialogues, a sort of yearning of the soul for the realm of the gods. It has come to us to be a sort of romantic love, and it stands with all of its beauty. We poets write about it and we read about it. I guess Shakespeare was thinking about eros when he said, love is not love which alters when its alteration finds or bends with the remover to remove. It is an ever fixed mark that looks on tempest and is never shaken. It is a star to every wandering bark. You see, I can remember that because I used to quote it to my wife when we were courting. That's eros. That's eros. But when we speak of loving those who oppose us, we aren't talking about eros. The Greek language talks about philia, and this is a sort of reciprocal love between personal friends. And on this level, individuals love because they are loved. This is a type of love that we have for our close and intimate friends. This is a vital, valuable love. Now, when we talk about loving those who oppose you and those who seek to defeat you, we're not talking about eros or philia. The Greek language comes out with another word, and it calls it agape. Agape is more than eros. Agape is more than philia. Agape is understanding, creative, redemptive goodwill for all men. Biblical theologians would say it is the love of God working in the lives of men. It is an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return. And when we come to love on this level, we begin to love men not because they are likable, not because they do things that attract us, but because God loves them. And here we love the person who does the evil deed while hating the deed that the person does. And it is this type of love that stands at the center of the movement which we are trying to carry on in the Southland, agape. It is also impossible to understand the Montgomery movement without understanding a certain spiritual basis of the movement. It's impossible to understand it without seeing that nonviolence in the final analysis is based on a sort of faith in the future. Now, I'm quite aware of the fact that there are persons who believe firmly in nonviolence who are not theists, who do not believe in a personal God. But I think every person who believes in nonviolent resistance believes somehow that the universe in some form is on the side of justice, and that is something unfolding in the universe, whether one speaks of it as an unconscious process, or whether one speaks of it as some unmoved mover, or whether someone speaks of it as a personal God. That is something in the universe that unfolds toward justice. And so in Montgomery, we felt somehow that as we struggled, we had cosmic companionship. And this was one of the things that kept the people together, the belief that the universe is on the side of justice. That is something in this universe which justifies Carlyle in saying, "No lie can live forever." That is something in this universe which justifies William Cullen Bryant in saying, "Truth crushed to earth will rise again." That is something in this universe which justifies James Russell Lowell in saying, "Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown stands God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own." And that is the reason in Montgomery, Alabama, that we can walk and never get weary, because we know that is a great camp meeting in the promised land of freedom and justice. This, in short, is something of a story that could not possibly be told in a lecture, just mentioning some of the points that held us together and some of the basic philosophical presuppositions of this philosophy. And God grant that as men and women all over the world struggle against evil systems, that they will struggle with love in their hearts, with understanding goodwill. For this is a philosophy that says you must move on with wise restraint and calm reasonableness, but you must keep moving. And this is the challenge to America. We have a great opportunity to build here a great nation, a nation where all men live together as brothers and respect the dignity and worth of all human personality. And we must keep moving toward that goal. I know that some people are saying we must slow up. They're writing letters to the North, and they're appealing to white people of goodwill and to the Negro, saying, "Slow up, you're pushing too fast." They're saying we must adopt a policy of moderation. Now, if moderation means moving on with wise restraint and calm reasonableness, then moderation is a great virtue that all men of good will must seek to achieve in this tense period of transition. But if moderation means slowing up in the move for justice and capitulating to the whims and caprices of the guardians of a deadening status quo, then moderation is a tragic vice which all men of good will must condemn. We must continue to move on. Our self-respect is at stake. The prestige of our nation is at stake. And we must come to see that the issue of civil rights is not an ephemeral, evanescent, domestic issue which can be kicked about by vociferous politicians, but it is an eternal moral issue which may well determine the destiny of our civilization in the ideological struggle with communism. We must keep moving with wise restraint and love and the proper discipline and with dignity. I close now, but let me leave this with you. That is, within every academic discipline, certain technical words that soon become cliches and stereotypes. They become basic words in the vocabulary of that particular discipline. Modern psychology has a word that is probably used more than any other word in modern psychology. It is the word maladjusted. It is a ringing cry of the new child psychology, maladjusted. Now all of us should seek to live the well-adjusted life in order to avoid neurotic and schizophrenic personalities. We should attempt as much as possible to be adjusted. But I leave you this afternoon saying that there are some things within our social order to which I'm proud to be maladjusted, and to which I call upon you to be maladjusted. I never intend to adjust myself to segregation and discrimination. I never intend to adjust myself to mob rule. I never intend to adjust myself to the tragic effects of the method of physical violence and to tragic militarism. And I call upon you to be maladjusted to such things. It may be that the salvation of our civilization lies in the hands of the maladjusted. I call upon you to be maladjusted as Amos, who in the midst of the injustices of his day could cry out in words that echo across the generations, "Let judgment run down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." As maladjusted as Abraham Lincoln, who had the vision to see that this nation could not exist half slave and half free. As maladjusted as Jefferson, who in the midst of an age amazingly adjusted to slavery, could cry out in terms lifted to cosmic proportions, "All men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." As maladjusted as Jesus of Nazareth, who dreamed a dream of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. God grant that we will be so maladjusted that we will be able to go out and change our world and our civilization. And then we will be able to move from the bleak and desolate midnight of man's inhumanity to man to the bright and glittering daybreak of freedom and justice. Thank you.
You have been listening to Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., The Power of Peaceful Persuasion, a speech that he delivered to students and faculty of the University of California, Berkeley, at its Wheeler Hall on June 24, 1957. This is the earliest surviving record of Dr. King as recorded and broadcast by Pacifica Radio. This recording has been preserved, digitized, and made available for this broadcast by the Pacifica Radio Archives. For more information, please visit the archives at www.pacificaradioarchives.org or simply call 1-800-735-0230. That's 1-800-735-0230. 0230.